So, hey everyone, I'm Mark. I'm joined here by Travis. Travis, how's it going, man?
That's pretty good. I think we met originally in On Deck, just had a mutual love for open source, and following each other since then. So it's great to join you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we met a while ago through open source, and now I think since early December, our whole lives have changed for the better, I would say. When OpenAI released ChatGPT, I think it was November 30th. I think I heard about it like a day later or 2 days later. And the first thing I saw was you had already started building something with
Yeah,
ChatGPT. And I guess we can like dive in right away. I think it's such a hot topic. Tell us what you built.
yeah, for sure. So I got really excited, like everyone else, when ChatGPT launched. I think within 48 hours, I had kind of a proof of concept of the ChatGPT npm package. And really just was excited at the ability to build experiments on top of it, right? And I was certainly not alone in that. Pretty much, most of the Chrome extensions, VS Code extensions, WeChat bots, Discord bots, etc., that have been built or in the last couple months were built on either using my kind of unofficial ChatGPT wrapper, or I run a Discord community called the ChatGPT Hackers Discord, and we have around 7,500 developers, hackers in there now, including some of the other open source developers who built, like the Python and the first version was super hacky, like really just wanted to unlock like what this new technology was capable of, and package it up into an API wrapper that people could play with and experiment with. The goal, and I've talked to some of the OpenAI folks about this, along the way. The goal was always that, we fully expected OpenAI to release an official API at some point. And so, the goal was to try and align as closely as possible with what that official API would eventually look like, and kind of replace it with the official API. But, really unlock the ability to start playing with stuff today. And that was a massive boost for the open source community and the ecosystem. I also built kind of one of the first real use cases on top of that API wrapper, which is a ChatGPT Twitter bot. Released that, I think, like December 1st or 2nd. And one of the great things about building on top of a super viral product launch is that it's pretty easy to go viral yourself as well. The Twitter bot, it was pretty simple. You mention it with a prompt, and it responds with the ChatGPT response. It passed 100,000 followers. I think there's 500,000 or so interactions, that it's responded to on Twitter. And in particular, it's cool because in a lot of countries, a lot of areas, OpenAI is banned, and those folks have been able to use it on a kind of neutral platform on Twitter, and just play around, get familiar with what this technology actually does. So between the kind of ChatGPT npm package, this Twitter bot, and then really just building and learning in the AI space in general, I've just had a lot of fun. Everything that I've talked about is open source and on GitHub. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I remember kind of like going back in time when Notion became really popular. I remember you were kind of like the first person that built that unofficial Notion API before they released it.
Yeah. Well,
And
I wasn't the first person necessarily, but I definitely built on what other folks had built. For instance, Timo and Tobias Lens had done a lot of open source work. Like that's what open source is, right? It's like,
yeah.
You take what someone else has built, you add on your own little thing. But I do really love creating high quality, Node.js TypeScript wrappers that allow people to hack on things that aren't hackable, or use them in interesting new ways. Yeah, it's powerful.
Yeah, I actually pulled up here on my browser. Maybe I can share that real quick. Share my window. Right. So I pulled up when ChatGPT was released. According to Google, it was November 30th.
Yeah, that sounds right.
First init on the ChatGPT API was on December 3rd.
Oh God, So I'm just looking at this though, like I don't know why, but there's spam, messages on GitHub where people just come in here and I mean, you kind of picked an interesting one. People will come in and comment on things, and they're just complete
That's hilarious.
spam.
I just saw that.
Yeah. So
Okay, that's really funny. That's a GitHub
yeah,
issue, a GitHub
yeah.
problem. And ChatGPT Twitter bot. So you were pretty
Oh yeah,
convinced that you want to do a Twitter bot right away. So a day
yeah,
later, you were like, okay, let's do this.
yeah. I mean, when you feel inspired by something and you just feel that like holy shit moment, right? It's important to be able to just act on it, and I think some people, their GitHub graphs are like just green or just like sporadic or whatever. Mine definitely goes in waves where I get really inspired by something and I just crank it out. I want to be fully invested in that. And I think over the last couple months with AI and starting with really the ChatGPT stuff taking off, has really, that I've been in my groove. So
Yeah, that's definitely something that I can relate to, that they're like open source does come in waves. It's unless you're working on something really and you enjoy it, like there's typically this like initial like period where you like start building it like crazy and you have all these ideas that you want to get out of your head. And then as you get into the period of maintenance, right, it like kind of like becomes longer periods of time when you commit actually new features, and most of it is kind of like workarounds or fixes. It's also a fun time, less fun obviously than building something new. But yeah, let's talk about ChatGPT bot for Twitter. I saw the tweet as of today of this recording. It hit 100,000 followers on Twitter. That's more than our both followers combined, I guess.
oh yeah, yeah. It's got quite a reach. I mean, I can share a little bit of kind of the story of building it. I wrote a little bit about it, but let me just kick things off. I'll share. Yeah, we'll get into some code in a minute, but just share some of the analytics. So this is the ChatGPT bot. The icon used to be green. I actually got contacted by OpenAI's legal department. They wanted me to change the avatar.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, so now it's purple, but whatever. So you can see it's got 102,000 followers in the last 28 days. So last month alone, it's got 56,000 followers. So it's really seen kind of an exponential growth over time. A lot of that has been, so I've seen very distinct periods where in the beginning it was all pretty much all English, and then for a while it was the German community, jawohl, and then at one point, probably about a month and a half, it started being pretty much all Chinese users. This person is apparently one of the largest kind of Chinese type
Million
users.
followers.
Million followers. And now I'm seeing a lot of Arabic usage. So it kind of goes in waves of the different communities that like, a large account will tweet it and use it, and then other people will see it being used and be like, oh, what is this thing? I'll check it out, whatever. And then kind of the month before had about 20,000 new followers. Month before that, 6,000 new followers. So yeah, I guess I can kind of go into like what went into building it. This is my general approach to stuff. It's just I learning as I go, right? Like, yeah. So we already talked a little bit about the ChatGPT npm package. Made it to the top of GitHub trending that first week. This is already a few months old. I think it's doubled in this number of stars, but clearly there's an interest here. Can actually show one of the most interesting things here is the number of projects that have been built on top of this.
That's open source right there.
Yeah, and these are I pretty much only accepted PRs for people to add stuff that were open source. So pretty much all of these are open source as well. And the first version of this, not nowadays, I am very much focused on using the official API, but the first version of it was really just reverse engineered. So like this is a screenshot, for instance, of the dev tools from the ChatGPT web app. You can see there's like a post to this conversation endpoint, and then some of the JSON payload of what is being sent, and fairly simple REST API. And I released the Node version, and then let's see, this is the Discord community that I've been running. We created a little website. So the Python, let's see here, like I think this one has, this guy, 22,000 stars. So this is made by a guy, Anthony Chung, who, he's in high school. He's a Python hacker. He's one of our admins. Just the community around this stuff is insane. And I think anyone who kind of frequents GitHub has seen it. Like these projects, anything built on AI these days is just taken off.
Yeah.
And then, there's a lot of other folks who have helped along the way as well, in terms of PRs, in terms of, might look simple on the outside, but it takes a community to build a project like this and keep it going. I can kind of talk. I think that the first version of the Twitter bot was pretty simple. This is a good early example. What's the meaning of life? Answering the style, the Big Lebowski. The first version had some serious problems. It would respond with text, and it would respond with a variable. In particular, that caused the Twitter automated spam detection. So it's not really said anywhere, but apparently they want like a 1-to-1. So if you mention it, you only get one response. And so I ended up getting a takedown notice from Twitter. And I mean, I could talk for a while about just the Twitter API and platform and stuff. It's a pain in the ass, but long story short, ended up switching to generating images on the fly using headless Chrome. And, I think it looks pretty nice. It's simpler to share a single tweet, a single image than a bunch of different tweets and stuff. There were a bunch of edge cases there. You can actually get ChatGPT to generate SVG images or URLs and stuff. And so if you're rendering Markdown, just things that you had to actually support. I had to actually add support for conversation and kind of knowing that you were responding to something you had previously responded to. And constantly was battling Twitter API's rate limits. So, Twitter has a hard limit of around 2,000 tweets per day from a single account. And so if you're a bot where, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are trying to use it, and it's a friendly, useful bot like this thing, it should be, so my understanding is that there is a way around that, or for old bots and kind of with the old version of Twitter. And that has, along with a lot of the other just logistical day-to-day stuff with the new Twitter, it's hard to get in touch with actual people. So I'm not too optimistic that I'll be able to get around that. But for now, that 2K a day limit keeps my OpenAI bill reasonable. So it's not all bad. So at a certain point, because of the 2K limit, I needed to create a heuristic for, maybe now I can actually just jump into a little bit of the code. But so this is the code for the ChatGPT Twitter bot. I'm just going to jump into one part, and we're going to take a look at the heuristic. So basically, we're going to look at the bot works pulling the Twitter API for mentions. So it's not based off of any webhook or any notification. It's doing a pull-based approach. It keeps cache of all the tweet mentions it's already seen. And so it's only, fetching the more recent ones. But after it fetches a bunch of tweet mentions, it goes through and says, hey, have I already replied to any of these? And then this part I want to talk about is the heuristic for assigning a score to each mention. And this started to become really relevant when there were 20,000 tweets waiting to be replied to in the queue. And, you'd have a user like that 1 million follower Chinese user who comes in and asks it. And I just wanted to make sure that there was some reasonable prioritization around this stuff. So one of the biggest factors is it a reply or not? So top level mentions are scored higher. They're more prioritized than follow-up replies. Okay. Or if you're replying in someone else's thread, that will be lower priority versus the top level tweet. The age of the tweet, that's this right here. Where are you at the age? The older you are, the higher priority you are. If the number of followers is a pretty big one, it's like a log base 10 of the number of followers that you have, the score will be proportional to that. And really, I just wanted to make sure, because the larger accounts have a much larger exposure on the Twitter platform, that they would have at least a more reasonable experience. It's not perfect. I wish that it could respond to everyone. Twitter's API sucks. This is a hack job, the heuristic, to try to get around that.
On a side note, I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of March, the Twitter algorithm for priority tweets looks similar to this.
Or the version of this where you have user ID equals Elon Musk. Yeah, I don't know. I will say that it's been a lot of fun hacking and building on top of the Twitter platform. I think it's very powerful. but there is a significant amount of what I would call platform risk with Twitter. There's just uncertainty around the API changes, talking about charging hundreds of dollars a month to use a completely hamstrung version of this API, that a lot of really useful bots that add creativity, that add a sense of experimental nature to the platform, like the ChatGPT Twitter bot or other ones that people have built. It's just going to kill off all that stuff. So I'm worried about that. Part of the reason why I haven't really tried to monetize this, it's unclear where I'm going to take this thing. At the very least, it's a massive amount of followers and usage. Let's jump back here because I was talking about kind of the heuristic. So this was talking about the unofficial ChatGPT API that this thing is using under the hood. And at a certain point, the OpenAI security engineers added a cloud to basically prevent most of the unofficial usage. If you look at the usage over time, again, this is pretty out of date now, but it at least gives you the first 2 months of the usage. You can see when it dropped to almost zero, that was when OpenAI added the Cloudflare protections. Pretty much meant that all of the API wrappers that we were using to access the unofficial ChatGPT API stopped working abruptly. But our little cartel of hackers quickly found a way around it, and we started using a headless browser, and then we found another way around it. I mean, the headless browser stuff was a pain in the ass, by the way, really just automating web app and then getting around captchas. Turns out that AI-based captcha solving is just completely changing the captcha industry. I don't know what the future of the captcha industry is, but current captchas are just like 100% solved.
Right.
And
but Cloudflare uses H captcha, if I remember, and that's like AI based.
They use multiple layers. So they do have reCAPTCHA, they have H captcha, but one of the biggest things that they do kind of under the hood is they assign a riskiness score to all of the HTTP requests that come through. And a lot of it is like, what is this IP address? Is it coming from a known data center IP, right? So if you're trying to run a server-based program somewhere on AWS or GCP or Azure, on basically any data center out there, and your IP is coming to them through that, that increases the riskiness score. They do like TLS-based fingerprinting, and they have a very sophisticated set of their own AI tools that are combating other people's AI tools and whatnot. Long story short, the headless browser-based version worked. It was a total hack. OpenAI hated it, and we kind of went back and forth with different versions of that. We ended up finding a version that used an unofficial REST API. There was one point we found a leaked model. So if you've used the OpenAI completions API, you put a model like Text DaVinci 003 or GBT 3.5 Turbo. It turns out there were some models that they had released to partners, YC companies, selected partners that were public, but just not documented. This is an example of an early one that was fine-tuned for chat, and it had at one point been actually used by the ChatGPT web app, and it didn't cost anything to use, right? So it was free. It used it because it was like only for partners. So we started using this, and it was great, right? Compared to using this horrible, this Chrome-based monstrosity, and it was just so heavyweight, and it was prone to error and different things. You know, using the official API with this unofficial model was amazing. And so later on, this is like a couple months after the fact, I heard from somebody at OpenAI kind of about them realizing that we were using this thing. And instead of disabling it, instead of shutting it off, they turned it into what they called CatGPT. They pretty much made it so that regardless of what you passed into the large language model, it would output different variations of a cat meowing. At this point, these unofficial API wrappers were being used by millions of people and thousands of different developers for random projects and stuff. So we started getting reports on our Discord and our GitHub repos of like, hey, I think I'm getting else's responses, or I think that my account is getting mixed up or something, but it all boiled down to this cat meowing at you, right? And apparently the OpenAI guys were like watching this and just laughing their asses off.
It's funny because it's like a real world cat and mouse analogy.
Oh, absolutely. I'm like the mouse in this scenario, and I'm talking to the cat about CatGPT. Hilarious story. We were going always back and forth with things. Again, the eventual goal, without a doubt, was to use the official API. It just wasn't released yet. By then, people had built experiments, and I wouldn't say necessarily like production quality product or company, but things that people were really using and the open source community kind of took off. And at that point, we were like, we need to keep it working, right? There's just so many people building and hacking, right? And so we ended up finding other little ways. The cat and mouse game continued on. Now I want to be very clear, use the official API. It's robust. It works really well. They're constantly making improvements to it. And it's not that cheap. Like they released the GPT 3.5 turbo model. It was 10x cheaper. That's what I'm recommending everyone to do going forward. Maybe just a couple of things. The Twitter bot was put in Twitter jail a few times for people getting it to say some not so nice things. I ended up adding moderation. So basically, like this function here checks a couple of special case regular expressions, and then it also calls into the OpenAI moderations endpoint. And if I go to respond to new mention, I like really verbose things of things. So the code that goes through and responds to things before I call into the OpenAI API, I check the moderation on the prompt. And then after we get the ChatGPT response, I'm checking the moderation on the response as well. Because what I've found is even if the prompt is okay, sometimes people are clever and will get the bot to say something that obviously shouldn't be said. So checking both the prompt and the response, basically. Since I've added that basic level of moderation, it hasn't been put in Twitter jail at all, which is awesome. So to give you an idea under the hood, this is the data model. So I have 500,000 of these interactions where we have a prompt, we have the calculated priority score, the number of followers that the user who prompted is asking, the actual prompts, and then the GPT generated response, some metadata, the inferred language. I had quite a few researchers reach out to me. I'm just giving away the data set for free. One of the interesting things is it also includes Twitter social information around the number of likes, number of retweets that the prompt and the response got, which for training these types of AI models, having human level feedback at scale of what's good and what's not good, it's an interesting data set.
Yeah, absolutely. So, especially at that scale that you have it. I was wondering the priority score out of what's the highest and what's the lowest? Is it from 1 or 0?
It's not bounded. So if I look at the config, I have a set of priority users. So this is my account. This is ChatGPTBot, and then this is one of my test accounts. But basically, if one of these users mentions ChatGPTBot, it pretends that that user has 1 million followers. So there's no upper bound for these things. And I really have this in here strictly for my own testing purposes. I have a couple other bots on here that I've explicitly had to ignore because I didn't want them having infinite conversations back and forth. It's something I started to see happening. I've had a lot of fun building this. And I think that just shows the power of one, open source thing in terms of the underlying API wrapper, and then the Twitter bot itself, fully open source. Two, being selective and choosing what to work on is huge. That's something that I've struggled a lot, and a lot of developers do. If you have a lot of ideas, how do you filter them down and figure out what to actually work on and get an MVP out that's very focused? And in this case, I got a version of this out really quickly. It started seeing massive traffic, and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to double down on this. It sounds easy. It's not in practice. Figuring out what to work on. I can show you this thing running. It's constantly running in the background right now, responding to stuff. So it'll pull out a batch of 10 tweets to process based on the priority score. Currently, there are 32,800 or so tweets in the queue waiting to be responded to. And it'll pull out 10 at a time, respond to them 2 or 3 at a time concurrently, and then keep going. But I just have this thing running on my local machine. There were a few times when I tweeted out like, hey, I'm about to jump on a plane. The bot's going to go down. It's not doing anything fancy. It's not deployed anywhere. It's simple, man.
This is blowing my mind right now. I did not know that you just running it on your laptop.
Oh, yeah. Command C. Now it's not running. Sex or index.ts. Okay, it's going to pick up and it's going to continue on. It's going to give it a second. It's going to fetch the latest tweets. And then it's going to choose the highest priority 10 out of however many are in the queue. Again, about 32,000, it found the ones that it hasn't replied to, and it's doing its thing again. So if I go in here, you can see the replies. 42 seconds ago, it responded to this. 50 seconds ago, it responded to this. It'll respond as quickly as the Twitter API's rate limits allow it to respond, which again is the main limiting factor right now, is that 2K a day.
Right.
Yeah.
2K a day. That's 80 per hour. if you run it for 24 hours. Okay.
It'll go, and then it'll hit a rate limit, and I just have it like, it just sits there and waits for like 5 minutes and then tries again. Nothing too complicated, simple.
I love that you run it locally. It's so cool. I know we're closing in on the end here, but I wanted to shift the conversation over to open source. There was this tweet the other day from Sam Altman that the ChatGPT history went down because of an alleged bug in some open source package that they were using. Everyone in the open source community got pretty annoyed and riled up because, first of all, we hate unspecific bug reports. Second of all, I mean, OpenAI has open in the name, but is very far from open source. What's your opinion on this? There's other open source models that are coming out. How do you see this entire landscape?
It's a great question. So let's start with the recent ChatGPT bug and kind of the open source implications of that. My best understanding, having talked with different people, is that it's most likely a bug in one of the backend libraries that they're using to power their ChatGPT web app. There's not a lot of transparency there. I responded to Sam with 3 questions. 1, which open source library was it? 2, are you sponsoring any of the open source libraries that you depend on, which is a huge topic? And 3, I have a friend of mine, Frost, who runs a startup called Socket Security, and they focus on essentially security of your tool chain. It's an important thing to keep in mind that there's this massive long tail of open source projects that we all depend on, especially Fortune 500 companies. I'm not saying OpenAI is a Fortune 500 company. They're getting up there. We all depend on the work of open source developers, maintainers, contributors, and sustainability is a huge problem in open source. It's something that I've struggled with over time. I think most open source developers who work in open source for the right reasons and really go into working on different open source projects because your heart is in the right place, you just want to contribute value to the world, end up over time experiencing some amount of difficulty, financial difficulty being the most obvious one, but it's not just financial. Joseph Jacks, who has a quote that I really like: open source is amazing at creating value and really bad at capturing value. My personal incentives and why I work on open source so much is I just want to create as much value for the world as I can. I personally care a lot less about capturing value or the economic incentives. Now, I know that's a relatively privileged position to be able to have. I've worked a long time in my career. I have a couple of different exits under my belt to be able to be in a position where I can even consider doing that versus a trade-off of what type of guaranteed income that I would have working for big tech. It's something that is very near and dear to my heart around my incentives for doing everything out in the open. Talk to me a couple of years, that might change. I don't know. But relating back to your question about OpenAI and it has open in the name and now kind of closed AI or whatever, I know enough to know that I don't really know. My understanding was they have an amazing world-class team. I know they have their reasons for not doing everything as open as folks in the community would like. I know that some of it has to do with, well, as we get closer to potential of AGI, or as these models get more and more powerful, there are serious existential risks. There's international political concerns. There's a lot going on that it's not just as black and white as open closed. One of the things that we've seen is that all of these large language models have almost zero vendor lock-in, which is great for open source, great for competition. If you're using an OpenAI API or Cohere or Anthropic or whatever, and you start using that to build an app, and at a certain point, you're like, oh, it's not going to scale in terms of the unit economics, or it's too expensive. Or you get to a point where you're like, well, I need to be careful about the privacy of what I'm sending. The great thing about building on these hosted AI models is that you can essentially swap them out with other versions or custom versions or open source models down the road. All fairly simple inputs and outputs and interchangeable. So we're going to see a massive amount of competition, both on the proprietary kind of closed source side, as well as on the open source side. That's going to push the quality higher. That's going to push the cost lower over time, which is great for the open source side of things. I'm really excited. For instance, Facebook's Llama released its state of the art or close to state of the art type large language model.
Yep.
And within a few days, somebody was, hey, here's a BitTorrent of
Yep.
all of the weights just completely leaked. It's so cyberpunk. It's so amazing. We're going to see a lot of weird stuff happening in the near future. And I personally believe that just being at the epicenter of open source and AI, it's a powerful place to be. There's so much cool, hacky stuff going on there, and so much low-hanging fruit too to build, whether you're building kind of consumer applications or your goal is just to build tools and packages for developers. There's so much low-hanging fruit to build. Open source is just set up to move just as quickly because it's so open, because it's so collaborative. So that's why I think the two mesh really well together. I just wonder right now, having ChatGPT, being able to ask the questions and stuff, it amplifies you. It makes you more powerful. I would say personally, the only thing that I have used that I would not want to go back to the previous version would be GitHub Copilot for coding. It'd be really annoying now to go back to the kind of raw version of coding that was perfectly fine with a couple months ago. There's going to be a lot of those type of moments, and I don't know what they're going to be. We don't know what they're going to be. Very excited though to be following all this and be building and hacking around out in the open and learning. The only thing I'll say there is we have ChatGPT community of people who are learning and building out in the open. So if you're also interested in this stuff, definitely come check us out.
Yeah, it's perfect. I wanted to mention also that because you were very outspoken about the open source and remuneration aspect, and that's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm very much interested in expanding that economy of the open source ecosystem. I'm working with this project called T, and it's founded by the creator of Homebrew. Homebrew is a massive package manager itself, and Max has kind of like struggled for many years with being compensated properly for all that value creation. It doesn't need to be a one-on-one value creation to value capture, but there certainly needs to be a balance. And right now it's completely imbalanced. As a package manager, T tries to build that foundational layer to remunerate open source packages and maintainers and contributors equitably according to their contributions. It's probably one of the most ambitious goals, I think, out there. This massive ecosystem that is open source, that is being relied on by every company on the planet, and trying to give back to the open source maintainers that have pushed us so far that we're here now.
It's a great point. I love what you guys are doing at T. I think it's great to experiment around with different models of funding, because sponsorships really just don't cut it. I'll say a couple of closing things around this, because like you, this is near and dear to my heart. Most people who get into working on open source get in it for what I would call intrinsic motivation. You're really excited about something, you're passionate about something, you have an idea that you want to explore, and you want to do it out in the open. You want to do it in a way that maximizes the exposure. You can create a community around it. Other people can contribute. It is the single most efficient value creation mechanism that humanity has produced, in my opinion, more than academia, more than traditional businesses, government, etc., because it's so open, collaborative, and unconstrained, untethered by any type of perverse incentives. Now, it may start as an intrinsic thing. You get excited, you build something, as you said before, early on, there's tons of energy, but over time, other people start using it and complaining, and things don't work or they break, you need to maintain it. And it becomes much more of, in order to sustain that initial internal impulse of creation, and to keep it the longevity of these things, you need some type of external factors, the main one being financial, to really keep it going and incentivize you to keep maintaining things. It's something that I've struggled with, because I just want to build cool shit and I want it to be maximally useful for the world. And when I've worked at Microsoft, Amazon, I worked at big tech, I've worked at startups, I've done my own startups. It's great, and I think it's incredibly useful, especially like, so one thing that a lot of developers I talk to don't really realize is open source developers are creators in the creator economy sense, and there's a lot that we can learn from the creator economy in terms of the pathway to sustainability, to monetization, that starts from you're creating the content that you're creating in a form of code. Now, I would argue that open source creators are the inherent value in their creations tends to I mean, it depends on the type of open source project, but a lot of it, tends to be contributing significantly more value than, outputting a YouTube video or a song or something. Not that those don't have value. It's just in terms of the economic, the direct connection between the economic value that is created, built on top of your work, like the OpenAI. Their API was based off of some open source library, right? There's just more of a direct connection there, and I
mean, in the end,
for a while, but I don't want to keep going on.
It's such an interesting topic, and I think you hit it on the nail, right? As an open source creator, you want to create something that the world uses, and it's considered a success if many people use it, but it's at the same time a curse in a way, because then all these people are dependent on whatever you've built. Let's take ChatGPT API, for example. I see here it's used by 13,849 other projects on GitHub. I mean, that's like 1,000 people at least that are relying on your API working, right? At least at that point before the official one came out. It's really crazy.
Yeah, and you also get a lot of people who aren't the most understanding when it comes to creating issues or when there are problems, and I understand, right? I've been on the opposite side where something isn't working for you or you don't have time to read through everything or whatever. It's just important to remember when you're working with open source or relying on open source that one, it's all just people under the hood, well, at least for now, right? And two, the vast majority of open source projects that out there are just lone people somewhere out in the world. They're contributing their time for free, and a lot of the people who are creating issues or things, they're working in companies, they're getting paid for their time. You got to be really careful not to treat open source projects and authors with that type of expectation, or find some way to contribute value back to them, whether it's sponsoring. A lot of projects nowadays support sponsorships, or it doesn't have to be financial value. It can be social capital. Share the project on Twitter and give props. The number of times that I get an issue that someone creates and just says like, hey, this project has really helped me, thank you. I love that. That's amazing. I wish more people would do that. It always brings a smile to my face, but just from the nature of things, the majority of time that you get issues, it's because someone's having a problem, and over time it drags on you. And if you don't have a way of sustaining yourself, whether it's from a mental health perspective, from a way of justifying it, from a financial perspective, it's tough.
There needs to be different ways of helping contributors, and sponsorships is kind of like the first and earliest method, lowest barrier option there is. That's it. And thank God GitHub absorbs the fees in between.
Overall, on the whole, I know there's a very select few kind of open source developers who have successfully made the shift to being full-time open source. It's really hard.
It's because it takes a certain persona, because if all you have are sponsorships, it's about you, the person behind the project, not the project. It's how can you sell yourself. And most of the time, developers don't want to sell themselves. It's nice if you get tech famous.
I like that.
But it's about the work, it's always been about the work. So that should be front and center.
Going back to like, open source developers are creators, and there's a lot we can learn from the creator economy. The majority of the successful ones have between 5 to 7 streams of income, and that might be like sponsorships is just one of them, right? Again, as you say, it's a place to start. Info products, selling your guide on how to do X really well is another one. I've fallen into this trap previously of assuming that because I'm a developer, I have to have a SaaS or some type of API product or something that sells software, and you really don't. You can make a lot off of selling your bits about your knowledge. The distinction between what you give away for free, what you do open source, versus what you try to monetize is a difficult one because I'm just going to open source everything, right? Like, why wouldn't I? After a certain point, once you build a following, once you kind of are pretty well known and you can reliably create open source projects that are providing significant value, there's no shortage of people out there who want to learn from you, who want to absorb info and try to connect with you. So there are multiple ways beyond just sponsorships. And I really like thinking about it as, what do other creators in other fields do? And the analog between the creator economy and open source developers being one-to-one pretty much.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end. I do want to ask you, though, if you have anything you want to share. I'm just sharing your Twitter handle, transitive_BS. I never actually asked you why that name.
Yeah, transitive bullshit. So you can go to our website, transitivebolt.sh.it. It originally came from, I think, a Colbert Report sketch from like 15 years ago, where he's talking about the transitive properties of bullshit and how you start with a little bit of bullshit and then you add some more bullshit and you end up with bullshit on the other side. Like the fact that it's like mathy, because I studied computer science and math, it doesn't take itself too seriously. I've had a few people be offended by my username, and to be honest, I was just like, if that offends you, it's okay. We probably wouldn't work together that well anyway. It just caught on.
It's very consistent everywhere across social, so
yeah,
I can find you there. And it starts with the same first 3 letters, actually. As your name. So that's a great coincidence.
Very much so. Well, I know, Mark, you're also trying to do the open source and the creator, kind of riding that line. And I appreciate you having me on. We'll be talking more in the future, I'm sure.
Oh, we certainly will. It's been a pleasure. I think we went into so many different topics. My head is already spinning. There were so many good audio bits that I'm going to take out of this video. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you,
much,
Mark.
man.
It's always a pleasure, my man.
Travis, thanks so much. Have a great day and talk to you soon again.
All right. Bye.